Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man tabi'ahum bi ihsanin ila yawmiddin. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu ittaqullaha haqqa tuqatihi wa la tamutunna illa wa antum muslimun. My dear brothers and sisters in Islam, as promised, we return to the biography of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the last time, believe it or not, we were discussing this topic was October 6th of last year. And we were talking about the slander of the hypocrites that was levied against the wife of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and how much of a devastating blow this was not only to the Prophet's household, but to the entire Muslim community. We learned how such behavior, such slanderous behavior, can be taxing on not only families, but the individuals that make them up. It's created a very toxic environment. And we also learned how patience and profound reliance on Allah can lead to divine exoneration of the innocent. And as we move forward in the timeline of the Prophet's biography, we can see, coming from this very dramatic experience, one of the most powerful moments in the Prophet's life. And we'll find that it didn't happen on the battlefield, and it didn't happen among his companions in their council, but it was in a dream. The Prophet ﷺ at this point in his mission had a dream in which he saw himself and his companions entering the sacred sanctuary of Mecca to make Umrah, performing tawaf around the Kaaba in peace. He saw that he was holding the keys to the Kaaba in his hand. It was a vision like many others that he had, which served as a promise from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so the story begins in Medina. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam shared this dream with his companions, and he told them that Allah Azza wa Jal had shown him making tawaf around the Kaaba, shaving his head, essentially fulfilling the rites of Umrah in peace. And so the companions, who were already eager to return back home after years of expulsion from Mecca, they were filled with hope. For them, this dream was not just a promise, but it was divine reassurance that their struggle had real meaning, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was, or his aid was just around the corner. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam then declared that they would begin to prepare for Mecca to make Umrah. And it would be a pilgrimage completed in peace and not in hostility. And so the Muslims, they prepared themselves. They put on their ihram, those very simple, traditional white garments, and brought along just what they needed to defend themselves and to hunt as needed. Some of the companions argued that they should bring all of their armaments and weaponry, because they would, of course, be looking for resistance from the Quraysh. However, the Prophet ﷺ reassured them that it would be a journey of peace. They prepared by purchasing 70 camels that would be offered in sacrifice to conclude the rites. And then they marked those camels in a very traditional way by putting garlands around their neck, showing that they were clearly for slaughter and not for anything else. The intention of the Muslims was very clear by the way they were dressed, what they were carrying on their person, and the camels that were in tow, that their journey was one of peace. This news quickly reached the Quraysh, and they prepared immediately. What was getting ready to happen sent shockwaves through their leadership. They would be faced with one of the most difficult decisions in their opposition to the Prophet ﷺ. This was a major dilemma. How were they going to respond to the Muslims approaching in this fashion, seeking to enter the city in a peaceful manner to conclude these rites and rituals. It would end in one of two ways. Either they would allow the Muslims to enter Mecca, and this would be seen as a defeat. If they simply let them walk into the city without standing up against them, it would be a tacit acknowledgement that the Prophet was legitimate. If they allowed them to enter in the city into peace, not only would it be a victory for the Muslims, but word would quickly spread among the surrounding tribes that the Quraysh were now yielding in defeat. This would be an especially powerful sign after the Quraysh did not come home with a decisive victory from Uhud. Allowing the Muslims to perform Umrah, to conclude these rites and rituals at this particular time, the rites and rituals that were very well known to the tribes of Arabia, it would also showcase Islam as being the religion of Ibrahim. If we remember the rites and rituals of Umrah and Hajj, they date back to Ibrahim, one of the revered icons and men of God among the tribes. And we have to remember that at this time, the Quraysh, what they were doing is claiming that the Muslims were destroying the traditions of their forefathers. And by showcasing them performing these very traditional rites and rituals, it would show just how much of a lie these claims actually were. This was on the one hand. On the other hand, perhaps as difficult an outcome if the Quraysh denied Muslims access to the sanctuary of Mecca. They would be violating one of the most sacred Arab traditions upon which their entire society was built, being the custodians of the Kaaba. The Kaaba was meant to be open to everyone that traveled to visit. Even enemies were to be left unharmed to perform sacred rites of worship. And if the Quraysh were caught denying people entry, it would be seen as one of the most flagrant violations of their own laws and traditions. The Quraysh's hatred and arrogance blinded them in this situation. They could not see reason. They could not understand or come up with a way out. They couldn't bear the thought of seeing the Muslims who they had once oppressed and run out of the city, killed some, maimed others, robbed and pillaged, attempted to assassinate their leader, the Prophet ﷺ. They couldn't bear to see them walking peacefully through the streets of Mecca. And so in their desperation, they resolved to block the Muslims' entry at all costs, regardless of how it would look to the surrounding tribes in the region. So they mobilized their forces. They sent out a cavalry to head them off, and they began strategizing how they would confront the Muslims without appearing to be unjust or breaching this sacred tradition. And so as the Muslims, they approached Mecca, they learned of the Quraysh's plan to intercept them with the cavalry. The Prophet ﷺ quickly changed course, which led him and his followers to a lesser known route that brought them to the place that we all know as Al-Hudaybiyah. That's how they ended up there. It wasn't a direct route to Hudaybiyah and then on to Mecca. The Prophet ﷺ adjusted accordingly, being flexible and strategic. At Hudaybiyah, the Muslims, they camped there, waiting to see what the Quraysh would do. And it ended up in a stalemate of sorts. It was like a standoff right there. And amidst this standoff, there was a man whose name was Budayl ibn Warqa, who was from the tribe of Khuza'ah. It's a very influential tribe in the region. He happened to be in Mecca at the time, and recognizing, like many others did, the futility of conflict and fighting, he stepped up and volunteered to be a mediator. Budayl, he approached the Prophet ﷺ at Hudaybiyah, accompanied by some members of his tribe. he listened to the Prophet's intentions, and he was struck by his sincerity. The Prophet ﷺ explained that the Muslims came to perform Umrah and not to engage in fighting. He even showed him the sacrificial camels that were going to be offered for slaughter as a proof of their peaceful purpose. He told him that he understood the apprehension that the Quraysh would have at their approach to the city because they were still in conflict. And so he said he would allow the Quraysh time to prepare for their arrival, which would be considered a concession. They would have to stop and they would have to wait, as opposed to proceeding immediately to perform the rites, just as any other group would do. They would enter the city to perform Umrah or Hajj without seeking permission. After meeting with the Prophet ﷺ, Budayl, he returned to the Quraysh and he relayed the Prophet's words and intents. And he urged them to allow the Muslims to perform their pilgrimage, emphasizing that the Muslims had no intention of threatening Mecca. Budayl's role here is very significant. He presented himself as a neutral party, tried to appeal to the reasoning of the Quraysh and reminded them of their own values, of their own hospitality and the sanctity of the Kaaba, which they were the custodians of. At this time, we have to understand the nature of what's happening, the political landscape, if you will. These two tribes, the Quraysh and Khuza'a, they tolerated one another. Khuza'a at one point were the custodians and they were ousted. And at this point, they were able to tolerate each other. The Quraysh, however, had continuous suspicions about Khuza'a's allegiances because they lost that seat of being the custodians. The Quraysh, blinded by their arrogance and hatred of the Muslims, dismissed the counsel of Budayl, and this was a political blunder. This was a terrible move on their part. Initially, they refused to even listen to him when he returned back to the city of Mecca. He was going to tell them, and they silenced him immediately. We don't even want to hear what you have to say. And eventually they allowed him to speak his piece. However, they rejected the compromise the Prophet ﷺ offered. Their rejection of Budayl's advice only alienated Budayl and by extension his tribe, pushing them further away from the Quraysh. Budayl, he offered to return back to the Prophet ﷺ to convey the intentions of the Quraysh. He was going to continue in this role of mediator. However, the Quraysh had already sent another man named Hulays ibn Alqamah of Banu al-Harith. There was already somebody headed to the Prophet ﷺ. Hulays was not of the Quraysh. He was from Banu al-Harith, and he was their leader and the leader of Al-Ahabish. Al-Ahabish were a collection of Arab tribes. It was a larger faction that were bound together, and he was acting as their leader. This Al-Ahabish group were allied with the Quraysh, primarily for mutual protection and shared interests. So the Quraysh, while determined to block the Muslims' entry into Mecca, they wanted to maintain loyalty with their allies, and so that's the reason they sent Hulays as their representative, as a badge of honor, if you will, assigning him a very important position. He was going to be their emissary to confront the Muslims and assess the situation. When Hulays approached the Muslim camp, the Prophet ﷺ, very well of the Arab traditions. And Hulays as an individual was known to be someone that valued those traditions of worship and religion. The Prophet ﷺ, before he even got into the camp, he told the companions to send out the 70 camels. Camels were decorated with garlands around their necks and marks on their body that they were reserved for ritual sacrifice. And so Hulays, as he's approaching the Prophet ﷺ, he sees these markings, identifies this tradition, and is not in need to go any further. He doesn't even go to talk to the Prophet ﷺ. He sees the camels and he immediately returns back to the Quraysh. He tells them, look, they're here on a holy mission to perform Umrah, to offer the rites and rituals, to visit and to pay their respects to the Kaaba. And he told them that if they prevented the Muslims from performing their pilgrimage, that it would violate the very principles of Arab hospitality and violate the sanctity of the Kaaba. He declared that the Ahabish, this group of tribes, would not support the Quraysh if they were to act in such an unjust manner. And this reaction was deeply troubling. It was embarrassing, in fact, to the Quraysh. It exposed their moral and political inconsistency, that they were willing to stop someone because of hatred and arrogance, singling them out, treating them unfairly, breaking their conventions of society for their own purposes. And so they tried to pacify Ulais. They said, look, just give us some time. Bear with us while we work out some type of an agreement or come to some terms with them. In the meantime, there's another man knocking at the Prophet's door on behalf of the Quraysh. His name was Urwa ibn Mas'ud. He was from Banu Thaqif. This is a second emissary now headed to the Prophet ﷺ. Urwa began questioning the Prophet's intentions. They want to know, why are you coming here now? You guys are still at war, at odds with each other. He's not only questioning the intentions of the Prophet ﷺ, but he's trying to undermine the loyalty of his companions, implying that the Muslims, many of them had faced hardship and persecution at the hands of the Quraysh, that if they were to apply some pressure, that these companions, they would abandon the Prophet ﷺ. He's trying to sow the seeds of doubt within the Prophet ﷺ and his companions. They were very calculated words. But the Prophet ﷺ remained calm. He was composed in the face of Urwa's skepticism. He explained the peaceful nature of the journey, what they were doing, reiterated that their only goal was to perform Umrah. The Prophet's measured and sincere response reflected his trust in Allah and his confidence in his loyal companions. Urwa stayed for some time with the Prophet in the camp of the Muslims, and he noticed many things. He was there to essentially record everything he could to report back to the Quraysh. He witnessed something that deeply affected him. He observed the unparalleled devotion of the companions to the Prophet ﷺ. Every action reflected their reverence and love for him ﷺ. When the Prophet made wudu, his companions rushed to catch the water that dripped from his hands, using it to bless themselves. When the Prophet ﷺ spoke, the companions, they listened in complete silence. It was as if they were hanging on to every single word that he uttered. He noticed the discipline and the unity of the Muslims in prayer, their unwavering loyalty to the Prophet ﷺ left Urwa amazed. He was dumbfounded. The observations that he made led him to the conclusion that the Prophet ﷺ was not an ordinary leader. Urwa, of course, would go on to embrace Islam and play a very, very pivotal role with the Prophet ﷺ. That was yet to happen now. But this was the very beginning of it. The Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims were distinguishing themselves in a very clear way from their opposition. And so when Urwa returned back, he reported everything that he saw. And he said to them, in conclusion, he said, "O people of Quraysh, I've been in the courts of kings and rulers." And he cited having been in the courts and with the Caesar, the king of Persia, the king of Rome, the king of Persia, having been in the presence of Najashi, the king of Abyssinia. And he said, "I've never seen a people so devoted to their leader as Muhammad's companions are to him." He was urging them to give way. And his words, they did carry some weight, but the Quraysh again ignored that counsel. And this response did not sit well with the allies. Many tribes had joined their cause, the cause of the Quraysh, because they promised them leadership, wealth, and honor. And here the Quraysh are violating the sanctity of the Kaaba. This is the center of their world, the center of their society. It's the thing that holds them together. That which they value the most is right there, and the Quraysh are violating its sanctity, denying peaceful worshipers from access. Their actions expose their arrogance and lack of principle. It degraded them in the eyes of their allies. The tribe of Khuza'ah, again historically aligned with the Quraysh, began questioning their loyalty. The Habish were also unwilling to move forward with the Quraysh if they refused to admit the Muslims. And they all were watching and witnessing the Muslims' sincerity and discipline, and they were comparing it to the Quraysh's obstinate refusal to uphold their own values. This was a turning point. The Quraysh were not just losing ground to the Muslims, but they were losing respect and trust among their own allies. And even before the Treaty of Hudaybiyah had been completed, the political landscape was beginning to shift in a major way. These shifting alliances, though not truly felt, the impact had not yet been felt by the Quraysh, would become a major blow to their position among the Arabs and serve as a pivotal moment in their downfall. Right here, this dream started it all. If we were to look at the Quraysh as they were, the pinnacle of Arabia, the jewel in the crown of the peninsula. At their height, there's something required to push it over the summit. So it begins the downfall. And this was it. And this is something that we need to remember now. Many of us, I know, are thinking, what's just happened? Some of us thinking, what did we just do? But for the landscape to change, there needs to be a catalyst. The Prophet ﷺ, divinely inspired, made a move here. This peaceful journey to make Umrah was a move that would force the issue. The Prophet ﷺ had to push the pace, if you will, even if it was going to be uncomfortable. He put his adversaries in a position to either admit defeat or commit a violation so egregious that those standing with them would reconsider and leave their side, or at the very least, they would become weary enough to begin reconsidering the value of that alliance. Brothers and sisters, it's obvious that such a violation has yet to occur, regardless of how devastating things have been. But the stage appears to be setting in a way that makes me think personally that it's just around the corner. So while we brace ourselves for an even deeper impact, we also need to be distinguishing ourselves as the ideal alternative. Wallahu a'la wa a'lam. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين من كل ذنب فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. بسم الله والحمد لله حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه كما يحب ربنا ويرضى ونصلي ونسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما. Brothers and sisters, when you look at the leadership of these two sides, the Quraysh and that of the Prophet ﷺ, you can see very, very different approaches, stark differences. The Quraysh, they relied on fear to maintain control. And think about these approaches as we have seen them unfold before our very eyes today. The Quraysh relying on fear to maintain control. Their campaign was based on fear, making people afraid. They were making them afraid of change, fear of losing power, fear of the Muslims' growing influence. And so they resorted to many underhanded tactics, spreading rumors, exaggerating threats, resorting to violence, etc. They clung to their arrogance, thinking it would secure their dominance, but fear is a weak foundation. It only works for so long. The Quraysh's tactics only ended up isolating them further. In contrast, the Prophet ﷺ built his community on values of justice, hope, and trust in Allah. He did not need fear to rally his followers. His vision of a just and united society was enough to inspire them. And once this vision was noted, once it was noticed by those initially aligned with the Quraysh, it became the cause for them to question that alliance. It was only a matter of time before the campaign of fear wore off. It quickly became old. The events of this scenario teach us that arrogance, hatred, and fear, like that of the Quraysh, lead to failure and isolation, while humility, hope, and trust in Allah, which was exemplified by the Prophet ﷺ, they inspire unity and lasting success. They also remind us, and this is something we cannot forget, that the path to victory is not always straight. The path to victory is not always 1 + 1 = 2. The path to victory is not always straight. In fact, it's very rarely straight. There will be twists and turns, ups and downs along the way. Some of those ups and downs will make us sick. Sometimes we might even question the direction that we're headed in. But they will be twists and turns that we must navigate, even if it means that the road we travel will be harder and longer. So brothers and sisters, as we face life's challenges, we must embrace these principles. Embrace the principles of patience, resilience, justice, and principled leadership, trusting that Allah's guidance will lead us to that victory, even when the path is not clear. So we ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us to embody these values and to overcome the obstacles that we now face into the future. Allahumma yassir wa la tu'assir wa tammim bil khair wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa akhiru